Most people looked at the shiny gold trophy on the stage and saw a simple corporate success story, but they missed the tectonic plate shifting beneath their feet. While the cameras captured the handshakes and the press releases touted another year of manufacturing excellence, something far more consequential was happening behind the scenes. This was not just a celebration of a job well done, it was the quiet dismantling of a 50-year-old economic myth that has dictated how North America sees itself. Before we dive into why this specific event has sent a wave of genuine anxiety through the halls of power in Washington, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who cares about the future of our economy. What transpired in Canada recently wasn't about a physical prize or a plaque on a wall. It was a demonstration of raw leverage, the accumulation of power, and the sudden failure of an assumption that has anchored North American trade policy since the middle of the last century. For decades, there has been an unspoken rule, a foundational belief that true manufacturing supremacy naturally and exclusively belongs within the borders of the United States. The rest of the continent, including Canada, was essentially expected to be grateful for the crumbs, to participate at the edges and be thankful for the proximity to the American giant. That long-standing assumption didn't just bend, it shattered in front of the entire world. To understand why, you have to look past the official narrative that was fed to the public. The official story was straightforward. Toyota's manufacturing operations in Canada secured yet another global award for quality. But this wasn't just any minor recognition, it was the definitive accolade that propelled them ahead of every other automotive factory on the entire planet. This single facility managed to outpace every plant in the United States, every plant in Japan, and every plant across Europe and Asia. Today, the most highly decorated and prestigious automotive manufacturing center in the world isn't in Detroit or Nagoya. It is situated in Cambridge, Ontario. If you choose to stop reading there, it sounds like a heartwarming human interest piece, a story of talented local workers and smart managers doing things the right way. You could offer your congratulations and move on. However, that superficial version of the story completely ignores the context that actually gives this moment its weight. This achievement did not occur in a vacuum. It took place within the most deeply integrated, politically charged, and economically vital industry in the North American landscape. The automotive sector is never just about building cars. It is a complex web of international trade treaties, intricate supply chains, labor standards, regional growth strategies, and national industrial policies all fused into one. The very second that Canada established itself as the undisputed global benchmark for quality within that massive system, the entire geopolitical balance shifted. For generations, the arrangement was designed to function in a very specific way. The United States was to remain the undeniable center of gravity for the industry. Canada's role was to be a supporting player, to provide the parts, to host the assembly plants, and to benefit from being close to the American market, but never to actually outshine or outperform the core. This integration was intended to solidify and reinforce American industrial dominance, not to create a legitimate challenger. What Toyota has now proven is that economic integration does not automatically hand the crown to the biggest player or the most powerful nation. Instead, the system rewards those who focus on superior execution, consistent investment, and a dedicated, long-term commitment to the craft. While Washington was distracted by endless culture wars, bickering over tariff structures, and shifting the blame onto workers for failures that were actually born in executive boardrooms, Canada was making a different set of choices. For years, these Canadian plants have been quietly and steadily accumulating these awards without any fanfare or dramatic headlines. That is precisely why this particular moment has hit the American political establishment so hard. This wasn't a one-time fluke or a lucky year. This was the inevitable result of decades spent meticulously building systems that value the quality of the product, the training of the workforce, and the philosophy of continuous improvement. The companies are the same, the supply chains are identical, and the trade regulations are shared across borders. The only real variable was the way the work itself was structured, organized, and respected. This is the point where the underlying panic begins to take hold in the United States. Global automakers do not make decisions based on political campaign speeches or patriotic rhetoric. When they decide where to direct the next massive wave of capital and where to build the next generation of vehicles, They look strictly at the data. They examine the historical track records. They want to know which plants can deliver world-class results year after year with zero drama and zero decline in standards. Canada has just provided them with an undeniable data-driven answer. If you are looking for the absolute peak of manufacturing quality in North America, you no longer have to guess where it is. You are looking at Ontario. Now, try to imagine the perspective from inside the Beltway in Washington for a moment. You have spent the last several years convincing the voting public that the only way to bring manufacturing back home is through the use of aggressive tariffs. You've argued that manufacturing success can be manufactured through pressure and punishment rather than through planning and investment. You have behaved as though loyalty can be demanded through threats instead of being earned through performance. And then right next door, a Canadian plant operating under the same continental trade rules manages to beat everyone on the field, including every single one of your domestic facilities. There were no grand speeches or threats involved, only superior results. This explains why the official reaction from the U.S. government has been a wall of silence. There are no celebrations, no public acknowledgments, and no joint statements. To acknowledge Canada's success is to invite a question that American policymakers have been desperately trying to avoid for 30 years. If Canadian workers using the exact same integrated North American supply chains can build the highest quality cars in the world, then the problem was never really about trade deals or foreign competition. The true problem was a failure of national priorities. This is the realization you were never supposed to have when you read that initial headline. Once you start pulling on that thread, the entire political narrative surrounding the decline of manufacturing starts to fall apart. For decades, workers across the United States have been fed a story that their jobs vanished because someone else played dirty. They were told that another country cheated the system, that another government provided unfair subsidies, or that some foreign factory stole what was rightfully theirs. That story is emotionally gut-wrenching and politically useful, but it is economically hollow. The Toyota story in Canada pulls back the curtain on a much more uncomfortable reality. If this analysis is hitting home for you, please remember to engage with the video by liking, commenting your thoughts below, or sharing this with your network to help us reach more people with these deep dives. When you provide a workforce with genuine stability, comprehensive training, and a meaningful voice in how things are produced, they will consistently deliver world-class results. However, when you treat labor as nothing more than a cost to be slashed and a liability to be minimized rather than a human asset to be cultivated, your quality will eventually fall apart. It doesn't matter how many national flags you hang over the factory floor, you cannot hide systemic decay. The Canadian plants didn't reach the top of the mountain because of some magical property of Canadian soil. They reached it because of specific, deliberate choices. They chose long-term, patient investment over the panic of quarterly earnings reports. They chose a cooperative relationship with labor instead of constant, aggressive brinkmanship. They benefited from public policies that viewed manufacturing as a vital national capability rather than just a convenient political prop to be used during election cycles. These aren't secret formulas. They are well-documented facts. They are simply ignored in any environment where power has migrated away from the factory floor and into the hands of the financial sector. This is the primary reason why this story has caused so much distress in Washington. It has arrived at the most inconvenient time possible. Current trade negotiations are incredibly tense. The threat of new tariffs is once again a central talking point. Behind closed doors, the rules governing the origin of automotive parts are being rewritten and fought over. Political leaders are desperate for any kind of leverage they can find, and suddenly Canada possesses a form of leverage that cannot be taken away with a sanction or a tweet. They have the leverage of a proven reputation, unmatched performance, and undeniable proof of excellence. When Canadian representatives sit down at the negotiating table today, they aren't coming as a junior partner begging for a seat. They are coming as the hosts of the highest quality manufacturing on the continent. This fundamentally alters the power dynamic of every conversation. It means that any attempt to disrupt the trade system doesn't just hurt Canada. It actively threatens the most productive and high-performing parts of the entire North American ecosystem. It puts at risk the very factories that global corporations rely on to maintain their brand's reputation for reliability. This is where the internal logic of our economic system is laid bare. Capital is loyal to profit and performance, not to nationalistic slogans. If Canadian factories can produce better cars with fewer defects, fewer expensive recalls, and higher levels of customer satisfaction, the money will naturally flow toward that excellence. No matter how much a politician yells on a television screen, you cannot use a tariff to create quality where it doesn't exist. You cannot bully a company into investing in a place where the underlying infrastructure and labor systems don't support high-end production. This is exactly why the mainstream media's framing of this story is so deeply flawed. They try to paint it as a simple story of national pride. Canada wins a game, America loses a game, and everyone checks the scoreboard. But that framing misses the most important lesson. Industrial success isn't determined by who has the loudest slogans or the most aggressive posture. It is determined by the strength of institutions, the depth of training systems, the fairness of workplace governance, the coordination of supply chains, and the discipline of long-term planning. When those foundational institutions are allowed to rot, no amount of political theater can make up for the loss. For the average person working on the line, these distinctions matter in profound, life-altering ways. A factory that makes quality its top priority is a factory that must also prioritize the skill of its people. High-skill work leads to better pay, more job security, and a safer environment for everyone involved. A manufacturing system designed around the idea of continuous improvement requires experienced workers to stay for the long haul. It cannot afford to churn through people like they are disposable parts. This creates stable communities where a factory job can actually support a middle-class life instead of leaving people in a state of constant grinding insecurity. Look at the contrast between that and what has happened in so many American manufacturing hubs. Plants are reopened with massive media coverage and political fanfare, only to be quietly automated, moved offshore, or shut down again a few years later. Workers are told they must be flexible, they must be grateful for whatever they get, and they must be patient, all while top executives rake in massive bonuses for cutting costs. When quality inevitably slips, the blame is placed on individual workers rather than the broken systems they are forced to work within. Training budgets are the first thing to be cut, and when the system finally fails, the people in charge look for a scapegoat anywhere they can find one, as long as it isn't in the room where the decisions were made. The story of Toyota in Canada cuts straight through that political fog. It proves that industrial decline is not an act of God or an inevitable law of nature. It is a choice. Likewise, excellence is never an accident. It is something that is built brick by brick over a long period. Canada didn't just stumble into this leadership position. They earned it by refusing to hollow out the very foundations of their production capacity in exchange for a quick profit. This is why the moment is so much bigger than a single company or a single award. It forces us to look directly at a fundamental truth about our modern version of capitalism. The current system is heavily weighted to reward those who can pull value out of a company as quickly as possible, even if that means destroying the company's long-term ability to function. But every once in a while, an outlier appears to prove that a different path is not only possible but superior. When that happens, it reveals just how fragile the dominant political narrative really is. The discomfort in Washington isn't really about Canada winning a trophy. It's about the fact that their favorite story is no longer believable. They want us to believe that power belongs to those who shout the loudest, those who make the most threats, and those who invest the least in the human beings who do the actual work. Once that story is exposed as a lie, the ripples spread very quickly. If quality, reliability, and long-term performance are the true engines of industrial success, then many of the policy decisions made over the last several decades look completely indefensible. We've seen decades of massive tax cuts for corporations that never bothered to reinvest in their domestic plants. We've seen decades of weakened labor laws sold to us under the guise of flexibility. We've seen billions in public funds handed over with no strings attached. All of this was justified by the claim that in a globalized world, there was simply no other way to compete. The Canadian automotive sector is living proof that there was always an alternative path. It simply required a different kind of political courage and a more honest understanding of who actually generates value in an economy. This is where we have to look closely at the intersection of money and power. Manufacturing didn't decline in the United States because the workers suddenly forgot how to build things or lost their work ethic. It declined because the very structure of who owns and controls the industry shifted. The rise of financialization moved the focus away from the product and onto the stock price, the quarterly dividend, and executive pay packages. Factories were no longer judged by the quality of what they produced, but by how cheaply they could squeeze out a result this month. Training was rebranded as an unnecessary expense. Routine maintenance became an optional luxury. Years of experience were treated as something that could be easily replaced by a cheaper, less experienced hire. Quality became something that you hoped for, or something you tried to fix later, with a massive recall after the damage was already done. In Canada, the incentives were aligned in a different way. It wasn't a perfect system by any means, but it was different enough to produce a different result. The government treated the automotive sector as a strategic national asset that needed to be nurtured. Labor unions managed to keep their seat at the table and retain real bargaining power. The pipelines for training and apprenticeships were kept open and funded. Companies that wanted to profit from that market had to show they were in it for the long term. Over time, this created something that has become incredibly rare in the modern economy: true stability. And stability isn't a boring concept, it is the most productive force in manufacturing. When a worker knows they will still have a job and a future next year, they take pride in mastering their craft. When a manager knows their career depends on the sustained performance of the plant rather than a one-time cost-cutting measure, they invest in better systems. When a local community knows a factory isn't going to disappear overnight, they build an entire support system around it: suppliers, schools, and infrastructure. That is how excellence begins to compound over time. The media almost never discusses these structural realities because they don't make for a good us versus them headline. Conflict is much easier to sell than a discussion on industrial structure. Personalities are easier to talk about than systems. It is much simpler to have a shouting match about tariffs than it is to explain why 40 years of underinvestment has gutted our national capacity. It is much easier to point a finger at a foreign rival than to explain how our own domestic policies have systematically shifted risk onto the backs of workers while funneling the rewards to the very top. But this moment with Toyota makes it much harder to keep avoiding those facts because the evidence is now undeniable. You have the same global corporation operating plants on both sides of a border. They are following the same trade agreements and selling to the same group of consumers. And yet the outcomes are night and day. That forces a direct comparison that no one in a position of power wants to have. For the people who actually do the work, the stakes of this conversation couldn't be any higher. When our leaders ignore these lessons, the cost is paid by everyone else. It shows up in wages that never go up, in work schedules that make a normal family life impossible, in injuries that happen because a line is moving too fast with too few people, and in towns that are left to rot after a single closure. These aren't just statistics, they are the lived reality for millions of people, all shaped by decisions that put financial extraction ahead of productive investment. There is a deep, quiet irony in all of this. The very system of integration that was supposed to guarantee American dominance has instead created a benchmark that now serves as a challenge to it. The North American auto industry functions as a single organism. When one part of that organism consistently does better than the rest, it doesn't stay hidden for long. It becomes the new point of reference. It becomes the standard by which everyone else is judged. That is what Canada has achieved. They didn't do it by making the most threats or by breaking the rules. They did it by deciding that manufacturing was something worth doing at a world-class level. That is a very bitter pill to swallow for a political economy that has spent years pretending that excellence is something you can just outsource to a machine or force out of a desperate workforce. The real question we face now isn't about whether Canada deserves its accolades. They clearly do. The question is whether any other government is brave enough to learn the actual lesson here. The temptation to learn the wrong lesson is already very strong. Leaders are already talking about more protectionism without any real investment, more pressure without any real planning, and more blame without any real reform. Those are easy paths to take because they feel good in the short term, but they don't build anything of substance. This moment is asking us to look at something much deeper. If we already know how to build a world-class manufacturing sector, and we are consciously choosing not to do it, what does that tell us about who our economic system is really working for? When you strip away all the mythology and the campaign posters, that question leads to a very uncomfortable realization. It reveals that many of the failures we are told are inevitable are actually very profitable for certain people. Economic insecurity isn't an accident, it's a feature of the model. A workforce that is always terrified of the next layoff or the next plant closure is a workforce that is easier to control. A town that relies on one massive employer is a town that is easier to squeeze for tax breaks. A government that lives in fear of capital moving elsewhere is a government that is easier to manipulate. The success of the Canadian auto industry matters because it breaks that cycle, if only for a moment. Think about everything that had to be in place for this to happen. It required long-term labor relations where unions weren't treated as enemies to be broken. It required public policies that treated human skill as a national treasure rather than a line item expense. It required a level of regulatory stability that allowed companies to think in terms of decades rather than weeks. None of this is a radical or revolutionary idea. It is simply a way of doing business that is incompatible with a model that demands the highest possible return in the shortest possible time. This is why the silence coming out of Washington is so loud. To admit that Canada is succeeding would be to admit that the decline of American manufacturing was never set in stone. It would mean admitting that different choices would have led to a completely different outcome. Once you open that door, you can't just close it again. People will start asking why those better choices weren't made. They will ask who lobbied against them and who stood to gain from doing things the way we've been doing them. This is where the reality of class power enters the room. The financial elite gain when production is treated as something disposable. Corporate executives gain when they are rewarded for cutting costs rather than for the quality of their craftsmanship. Politicians gain when they can use empty symbolism instead of doing the hard work of policy. But the workers lose, their communities lose, and the long-term strength of the nation is eaten away. The Toyota plants in Canada have exposed this trade-off more effectively than any political speech ever could. For far too long, manufacturing policy in North America has been nothing but a series of reactions. A crisis hits, the government throws some subsidies at it, everyone takes a photo with a hard hat, and then they all move on to the next distraction. There is almost never a sustained, serious commitment to rebuilding the underlying systems that are the true source of excellence. Our training programs are a mess. Apprenticeships have all but disappeared. The deep knowledge held by veteran workers is allowed to walk out the door when they retire, never to be passed on to the next generation, and then everyone acts shocked when the quality of the product starts to fail. What Canada has shown us is that continuity is everything. Experience builds on itself. Institutional memory is a precious resource that you cannot just buy with a tax incentive or create with a slogan. When a factory wins award after award for 20 years, it isn't because of one genius boss or one lucky break. It's because the entire system is set up to learn from its mistakes and get better every single day. Here's the part that should really keep policymakers awake at night. This success didn't require pulling out of the global economy or hiding behind a wall. It happened right in the middle of a wide-open, highly competitive, integrated market. This means the old excuse that globalization makes it impossible to have high standards is officially dead. It was never about whether it was possible. It was always about what we prioritized. As this story continues to unfold, please make sure you've liked the video and shared your perspective in the comments. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know what topics you want to see next. For the ordinary people watching all of this, the biggest danger is that our leaders will learn the wrong things. They might try to claw back some power through even harsher trade rules while completely ignoring the structural rot in their own backyard. They will talk about bringing jobs back without doing any of the work to rebuild the social and educational foundations that actually make those jobs worth having. A factory full of people who are underpaid and stressed out is just a building with machines in it. The Canadian example reminds us that manufacturing is at its heart about trust. It's about the trust that your hard work will be rewarded with a stable life. It's about the trust that if you improve your skills, that improvement will be valued by your employer. It's about the trust that you can actually plan for a future. When you take that trust away, no amount of political bullying can force a high-quality product into existence. This moment is a mirror held up not just to the politicians in Washington, but to any society that claims to value hard work while simultaneously cutting the legs out from under the people who do it. It is an uncomfortable mirror because it shows us our choices, not our destiny. It shows us what is possible when a system is built around creating long-term value instead of short-term wealth for a few. The question now is whether anyone in a position of power is willing to look into that mirror with a shred of honesty, because once you see the truth, it's impossible to go back to the lie that decline is just something that happens to us, or that workers just need to work harder in a system that was designed for them to fail. If there is a bigger lesson here, it is that real excellence doesn't leave any room for excuses. When one part of an integrated system is doing significantly better than everyone else, you can no longer blame outside forces. You can't blame the global economy because the rules are the same. You can't blame the technology because the machines are the same. You can't even blame the workers because it's the same company hiring people across a border and getting two different results. What you are left with are the decisions made about how to lead, how to invest, and how to treat labor. This story isn't really about Toyota, and it isn't even really about Canada. It is about the specific version of capitalism we have chosen to build, and the fact that we keep being told it's the only one that can exist. A version of capitalism that prioritizes extraction over actual production will always struggle with quality. A version that treats people like replaceable parts will always destroy its own potential and then blame the workers for the fallout. The Canadian plants prove that there is another way to organize an industry that is not only viable, but superior. They are setting the pace that everyone else now has to follow. This should be the catalyst for a total rethink of industrial policy across the continent, but rethinking policy is a threat to the people who benefit from the status quo. It is much easier to just change the subject, start a new trade fight, or turn the whole thing into a national rivalry instead of admitting a systemic failure. For working families, the price of that avoidance is massive. When we refuse to learn from these examples, insecurity becomes the permanent state of things. Jobs become temporary, skills become useless overnight, and entire regions are left stuck between a false hope and a quiet, slow decay. None of this has to happen. It is the outcome of a system that has very clearly decided who it wants to protect and who it expects to take all the risks. This is why these moments matter, even if they seem like technical business news. You might not work in a car factory, but the logic you see here is being applied to your healthcare, your schools, your energy, and every other part of your life. When systems are built for a quick buck, the quality of your life goes down. When they are built for long-term value, everyone benefits. The silence from the American leadership isn't just because they are embarrassed, it's because they are lost. They know that acknowledging this success means opening a door to a conversation they can't control, a conversation about the rights of workers, the role of the government in the economy, and the failure of their own ideology. Those are questions that can't be answered with a simple slogan on a hat, and yet those are the exact questions that workers are already asking. They want to know why one plant offers a future while another offers nothing but anxiety. They want to know why one country invests in its people while another treats them as an expense. These aren't radical ideas. They are the most rational questions in the world.